We thought we'd just sort of maybe start by putting some points on the table, and then just to kick us off, and then people could pick it up from there. So maybe I'd like to start with some things that's been happening, like designing China could also mean China designing, right, which is one of the things that we could talk about. And if you start here from the most radical point, like Ai Weiwei, who was telling us that everything seems shiny and bright and so on and so forth, but it's basically dark and dirty. I mean, maybe just one simple example would be, the space that we're in, right? I mean, it's state-owned, and the hotel that you're living in is state-owned, but not only that, it's, I don't know whether this is a fact or not, but it's owned by the secret police. So it's like this, it looks like an ordinary 3-star hotel, right? And everything works, but there's this other thing going on all the time, right? And this is a fact that we have to sort of be aware of. But then maybe the point to make is that does this make Shanghai or China today a totalitarian country? That's probably much too simplistic a description. I think the least you would have to say is that it's a kind of new totalitarian country. We'll have to think in terms of new, as in new colonialism, new totalitarianism, which operates, as it were, by new, different methods. Because on the one hand, you see this openness and progressiveness. At the same time, the feudal base, as I always say, is still very much apparent. So I think one of the things that we might consider is this, that the way in which, you have this model which is not a completely clear-cut one. I mean, you have always this oscillation, I think some use that word, between two things, what seem like freedom at one level, the always level, with the bright and shiny, and of course the dark as well. And what you have is this oscillation, and I think we were talking about oscillations and perpetual motions and all that, right?
If we went beyond that.
And maybe the first point is that it would be really simple if China were just a totalitarian country, but exactly because it's mixed, that's where the complexities are. Just as in the very socialist market economy, which we started off with. And one example of all this would be, for example, the nature of censorship in China, which of course is there and something that we, I think, raised in passing in relationship to design. And maybe one of the chief characteristics of censorship, as all the filmmakers, artists, writers, playwrights have told us, is really how arbitrary it is. Right? Arbitrary in the sense that you don't know when something would be censored. Right? Sometimes the most extreme things could be allowed to pass. At other times, the most innocuous detail would mean that the whole play or novel would be censored. And I think this is an interesting detail, because one of the ways in which power might operate is by keeping us on our toes. Right? Power which is sort of irrational, unpredictable, you don't know when it's going to hit you on the head. And I think that's how censorship works. Of course, it's we always complain about how stupid the Chinese censors are. But of course, if you think about it, it's the job to be stupid. Because if they were not stupid, they would not be as effective censors, right? And they would listen to reason, and you'll be able to persuade them now and again, right? But the stupidity is very important, right? The fact that they are stupid and they just sort of do cuts at all kinds of irrelevant moments. And this, of course, leads to another point which our discussions of design have put on the table, which is the indirect way in China and maybe many other places in which power operates. For example, Williamson gave us quite a nice analysis of why dramatic works now move towards the spectacle. Right? Like you see the Olympic opening, but not just that, but entertainment, spectacle, partly because the spectacle becomes a kind of substitute for ideas. Right? You can't have ideas, you can't have opinions, so everything is directed towards this, this notion of the spectacle, which of course would lead us to the following question. And I think it was a subject that was raised this morning with the New School presentation, which is there a politics of the spectacle now? Obviously, we've all heard of Society of the Spectacle, we've all heard of the law and so on and so on, who raised this way back in the 60s. But one point that seems to be less obvious or less discussed is that De Boer also wrote a follow-up text, where he did not repudiate his early ideas, but he basically revised them drastically, which is the 1988 notes on the Society of the Spectacle, where spectacle in 88 became what we were talking about this morning, namely information. Right? And the problem of information, one of the problems of information is that it is really resistant to visual understanding. You know, resistant to visuality. So for example, one of the early ways in which we might think about visuality would be this: how you make the visible intelligible, right? Or how you read, for example, ideology hidden in the image. And this was the early formulation of the spectacle, right? Where De Boer said, what is spectacle? It is the moment when it is the in a spectacle you don't have an image of ideology. In a spectacle, the image is the form that ideology takes, right? I mean, you don't even have to say anything. Right? The image is the spectacle is the form that ideology takes. Now you see, I think the point I'm making and in relationship to a lot of discussions we've been having is that this form now is no longer a clearly visible form. Right? I mean, this link between, and this was also something we've talked a lot about, right? This link between two things. I mean, one way in which it came out was surface and depth, right? Whether there's a link between them, or in architecture, form and function, whether buildings tell you anything about what lies inside. But it's an image and the object it stands for. Now, I think even in the film we saw just now, right? There's this reversal. It's no longer a question of having an image of an object. It's the way in which objects now are made to fit the image, right? Like the object fits the logo, not the logo as a suggestion of what the object is. You see, I think we've gone even beyond that. We've gone even beyond that, say. What you have here, of course, is maybe really the irrelevance, right? The irrelevance of this relationship. It's not just a reversal of the relationship. It's not a moment when the image now is more important than the object. Right? You have a moment when the relationship between images and objects have, to a certain extent, been disconnected. There's certain disconnect, which we saw, I think, also in all the discussions about urbanism. Right? Urbanism and urban form, all these arguments about images of the city, what these images of the city can tell us about the city. And the starting point for that today, I think, would have to be images of the city tell us nothing about the city. Right? Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't a relationship between images and the city, but it's never a direct one. Right? And one way in which you might bring the relationship back is to say that the city in all its strange forms would seep into the image when it is not located. And then the difficulty here would be to try and analyze how the seeping takes place. Now, all this, I think, would lead to another point which we could make. Is, I think there was some criticism about this seminar as being not political enough. Maybe not all of you might think that, but some of you, I think, have voiced this point. And I think the way to maybe address this question is like in the situation we're trying to describe. Politics would have to take a fairly different form, right? Like if you look at a lot of the Chinese artists that spoke to us today over the last 2 weeks, some of them might appear, let's say, in an American context, to be very anti-political, to in fact try to avoid all the political issues, etc. But you know, the situation as we were trying to describe at the beginning, right, is so shot through with politics. I mean, everything you do is affected by that. You know, even as we said, this hotel that we're living in. I mean, and you cannot help being implicated, and even to a certain extent complicit, right, with certain things that's happening. So the question, therefore, would be what choices there are, how you would sort of.
There's a sense in which you can't be not complicit, even not living here.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
if you think you're living in America and you're not complicit with China, think again.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So let me just make just two more quick points, and we can open it up. One point would be something that we have we raised maybe most obviously in Josh Komarov's presentation that a lot of people like. And one of the notions there, or one of the possible notions there, would be this notion of design from below, right? Design without designers, and so on and so forth. What I would suggest is maybe that would not be the conclusion that we can draw from that, right? Because design from below is a very particular kind of one particular form of design. It's a little bit like if you compare it to the critique that Williamson made about Mang Jingwei's productions. The productions he liked, the production he liked was this production called Two Dogs, and that's a very good production and very interesting play. But one of the implications, and that of course is like design from below. It's about allegories for marginal figures, allegories for immigrants, and so on and so on. But one of the things that this led to, it seemed to me, in this implied critique, was that the other things that they did were seen as spectacle, right? Seen as like, as it were, being complicitous with the market, trying to make money, and so on and so on. But in fact, I think what we saw in some of the clips is that it's even this question of class, right? Like low classes and middle classes, has many different implications and connotations. That one of the interesting things, for example, that their plays do, is to explore this other area of like spectacle, which is not like the state spectacle. Like, for example, one aspect of everyday spectacle would exactly be what? Fashion. Right? Fashion, which at the same time is also like self-fashioning, the youth culture. I mean, this the sort of the punk characters that you see in Mang Jingwei's drama is a level of social life here and a level of design, right? Which doesn't quite simply fit into this as an opposition between the below and above, right? Design from below and design from above. That I think what we're seeing is a kind of twist in the model. And one final point would be we've talked also quite a lot about identity, right? And the identity of China, and I suppose the most discussed example was the one that Liu Li gave, was his analysis of the Jinmao building, which has to look like a Chinese pagoda, because you need to reintroduce Chinese characteristics in order for this for architecture not to be placeless, right? Not to be just something that's plonked into China, like from another planet, and so on and so on. That's one side of it. But of course, what we saw in the Jinmao building, I think Liu was quite clear about this, is that by making it look like a pagoda, are you in fact establishing a kind of identity, or are you not basically giving us cliches of identity? Right? It's not just it's exactly like the question of the exotic. Right? What is the exotic? The exotic is not the other. The exotic is exactly cliches of otherness. Right? So it's like identity here has in fact been exoticized. Right? You exoticize it, and one way of doing it is by, as it were, hanging onto these cliches of otherness. And at a certain level, this is almost pornographic. I mean, it's pornographic in the Nabokov sense of pornography, when you define pornography as the copulation of cliches. So copulation in both senses as intercourse, right, and grammatically as linking together, right? So as a link verb, which is a copula, but copulation would be this other thing. So pornography as nothing more than the copulation of cliches. And that, of course, is also very much what identity is, right? Identity is not as Woody Allen would describe masturbation, that at least you're making love with someone you love. You're having sex with someone you love. It's not that, right? It's really the Nabokov view of pornography. Yeah, so we could open it up, and David might want to say something before we start.
I just want to keep alive. I'm not going to talk for nearly as long as Akbar have anything really interesting to say, but I just want to keep alive the strain that is pervaded very much from day one of this, and is a driving principle of sort of what was at work here concerning the shifts and the openings up in how I hesitate anymore to say how critical theorizing is to be enacted, and I'm just going to say thinking today, right? I want to link it to Beautiful World. I mean, Beautiful World was made 4 or 5 years ago, and as Akbar suggests in these remarks he's just made, very quickly in passing, it's not even almost, it is already dated. And its datedness, I think, has to do not simply with its references, right? Many of which are already 4 or 5 years old, and in the temporalities of our time, I mean, that's ancient, right? But it has to do also with its modality. I mean, it's a very mash-up mode of production. And while we've been celebrating, we, not just here, but generically, celebrate mash-up as the mode of production of our time, that too is all but passé. So I was thinking, so as I was speaking, how one characterizes how thinking in a theoretical vein, in this kind of poor theoretical vein that we've been trying to reference over here, and the kinds of characterizations that quickly come to mind have to do more with fragilities and vulnerabilities and what I call seepages. What yesterday in the theatre panel, for those who were there, was characterized as mutations. I mean, these modes that apply as much to thinking as they do to the objects of thought at this point in time become ways to try and get at, I mean, again, hesitate to say capture, because there's it's more like captivation than capturing, right, at this point. How one takes up these modalities of thinking and link them, I mean, as was said this morning, to modes of practice in genuinely new ways. And it's these fragilities which are as much fragilities having to do with the conditions of the world we're in as with the modes of thought that are able to characterize in some sense. The quickly morphing, transmorphing, mutating fragilities of the conditions in which we live. Shanghai is an interesting city, not unlike New York in maybe still. There today, gone tomorrow, right? I mean, literally, you turn a corner, and something that was there yesterday has already been effaced, erased, turned into something else, transformed. Whether or not by design, right? And so I think we're still struggling with how to characterize modes of thinking in a critical vein, sort of as, not just as this is taking place before our eyes, but as it becomes the very lived condition in which we find ourselves. So we should open this. So I just want to keep alive that strain of thinking that started with that first panel on day one, with particularly Ashil and Sarah, who came back to these thematics time and again, and others, Michael Keating, and others sort of over the period. So, yeah, I mean, a question we wanted to pose was what we take to be the driving conceptions, the driving questions. I mean, still coming back to that, to put it on the table.
So, I mean, thank you very much, first of all, for everything, including this great wrap-up. I wanted to comment on a couple of things that both of you said about the image of the city and the seeping and the questions of transformation, which goes back to this notion of fabric that I was trying to get at in my presentation, and the notion that an urban fabric, in fact, constantly moves and transforms, and there's something that's built into that, which is sort of seems important, especially as little I managed to be walking around, is this question of how, in a sense, memories of things get also themselves passed on and transformed. It's one of the things that it seems very important to me in characterizing the difference between the total erasure of a certain type of modernism and then the kind of empty recycling of the spectacle of postmodernism is another position, which I think would include, to a certain extent, a mode of transformation that might be able, within itself, to let the seepages of memories themselves be transformed. And I keep coming back to this notion of fabric, because in a sense, fabric is itself something that clothes us. It's an object of design that is neither designed from a designer or designed from below, but it's something that is also something to do with the wearer, with the user of the space, with the user of the clothes. And so, in a way, rather than having a juxtaposition, I look at ways in which a subjective rethinking of that form of fabric, an intersubjective rethinking of that form of fabric, may include within itself things that might transform the object, and in transforming the object, transform the self. I mean, after all, design is a piece of material culture, and in that respect, I think it holds the traces of the people who have used it and how they have used it and transformed it within themselves. So I rather think of consuming not as consumerism, but as forms of the form of consumption, in a sense, that comes with clothing, when things get worn and they get worn out. And to a certain extent, that's why I'm interested in objects and objects of design, because they contain within themselves the space in which they live and the people that use them. And in that respect, they can even transform the relation between what's high and what's low. So, and then this question of memory seems to be really, really important. I mean, for what very superficial sense I got of what's happening here. In many ways, as you said, how do you get away from making seep through buildings and through the fabric of the city something that belongs to the identity of the city, without monumentalizing or without turning it into a cliche. So it's forms of, and that's why perhaps Shanghai and New York are interesting to me in similar way, and I was glad you made that parallel, is because they're cities that are able, through this form of seepage transformation in the making, of keeping hold without nostalgia, but without also being the emptiness of the spectacular citation of history, which postmodernism was. So it's yet something else.
No, I mean, just to add a little to this. One concrete example was the fashion designer we saw yesterday, the second one, Lu Quan. Right? And there, I think in this design to see exactly this relationship between fashion and memory. Right? That it's a memory of Shanghai, which is like a kind of constructed memory. Because I mean, for me, what was interesting was the way in which it took the detour of Galliano, right, and then back to Shanghai via Galliano. You know, I mean, it's this strange re-import of a certain memory. Right? It's a memory of Shanghai in terms of which the clothing, the fabrics, and the memories are built.
But that's what happens in the image of the city itself. I mean, what's an image of the city if not, in a sense, the layers, the seepage, and the transformative elements that also go into other cultures and then come back? And that's, I mean, to me, that seepage also means a movement that's a cultural movement. So it may not seem political, but it's extremely so, because in many ways that it's that motion itself that creates the form of fabric that then comes back, and it's quite. I think it's quite important not to think of the two things as separate in that respect.
Well, I mean, are there, for example, other concerns, other themes?
So just in the last couple of days, I mean, again, the seminar's been really interesting in different ways, and I really appreciate it. This isn't a critique at all. I was wondering, though, if you can sort of help me with, this is kind of our last hour, with questions that I'm still puzzling through for 2 weeks. That's a good thing.
That's what the thing is.
Indeed. So what I've been thinking is, the seminars come from the USA to China as though in search of something new, for example, new forms of enterprise. And I'm wondering, whether India could be next, and whether the quest for the frontier in the States has in effect now gone so far west that it's ended up in the east. So the sphere is now closed, and I'm worrying it's to no sort of net effect. The bubble just gets bigger and bigger. And I've got to say that out on the streets of Shanghai, I have an alarming feeling that I'm living in a bubble, and I wouldn't want to be here when it bursts. So it seems then to me no surprise that our theory is moving back to the pragmatic and the details, as we become unable to question that bigger sphere of modernisation. And I'm wondering rather, is arbitrage and risk in design engaging with something more historically significant than a new stage in capitalism? Or to put it most succinctly, what object lesson do you think I could take back to California and say, look, this is something new, or this is something different?
Ben could respond to this. At least to wake you up.
You're on the line. You're going to earn your key.
If I had kept my eyes open, I wouldn't have gotten this far.
It's a very long and dull.
I actually don't know how to answer that question except by an analogy. And this argument I've had for 25 years with a friend of mine, Moish Postone, who many of you may know from this book on paper time and the commodity. And the problem of whether behind any notion of instability there's a new horizon of abstraction. Because in the classic account, the form and content distinction and things like that are supposed to come from the value, use value, opposition. that's the interesting question when you go to risk and uncertainty. When you go to things like derivatives, which aren't production-based, but connection-based. And the problem becomes circulation, not production. And then the issue of brands, which is a way to control circulation, all the ways in which objects and brands reverse their priorities, whether or not what you're beginning to see, which is what derivatives are based upon. It's an abstract notion of risk. When you model derivatives, you don't care. The model doesn't care whether or not the price of the derivative goes up or down. It measures the volatility. The volatility is the measure of the price. First thing. The second thing that's really interesting is this role of arbitrage. I mean, the idea, the goal in finance is arbitrage. Riskless profit. Instantaneous riskless profit. That's the goal. All right, and that completely warps your normal time system. Because the normal time system for production, risk is as time unfolds. All right, that's the manufacturing process. With riskless arbitrage, it's exactly the opposite. You have to have simultaneity, that is, price differential, price differences at the same time that you can buy low and sell high. The classic way of making a profit is buy low, sell high at two different moments in time. So how you think out that conjuncture seems to me to be what's at stake right now, and whether we're morphing into something different or not, where, especially after the present financial crisis, which I don't actually think will change the logic of what's emerging. As a matter of fact, I think actually Brian's paper actually was fascinating to me because the images that are emerging of the global city as the concentration of these forms of capital really show that this stuff is had. Shanghai is, of course, going to be supposedly the financial center of China. Hong Kong has been very much involved in the selling of instruments. Actually, Japan is interesting because Japan has resisted. I mean, so even when you look at the economics and the financial location of these things, you get a very different model. Anyway, that's the part.
Can I just riff off that as a way of trying to address your question? You might not want to be in Shanghai when the bubble bursts, but when the bubble bursts, it's going to have such ripple effects that you might not want to be anywhere, right? Which is to say that the vulnerabilities are as large now as the systems that kind of interact between them, which is another way of saying there's no riskless profit making. I mean, it's beyond the American dream. I mean, right? It's the global dream that is an absolute myth, and underpinning of which is this intense set of vulnerabilities that are capable of being weathered by different people, to different degrees, by different people subject to different conditions in the world. So it's interesting that as riskless living, to put it more broadly, becomes a dream, a commitment, a set of conditions, precarity absolutely coterminously becomes the lived condition of the bulk of people in the world. I mean, those two things go together. So to morph from that into more directly addressing the question, what do I take? There's no one thing I think you can take from this, right? There's no one lesson. The complexities are so great that there are no singularities left. I mean, even as the singularity, to use Kurzweil's sort of modality, it might be something to be reached for. That singularity, as a conception, is so fraught with variation, variability, and it's a variability in its localization that becomes more interesting. So I think if you take anything away from this, it's to invoke a very old term in a new way, and that's the struggle over not simply the conditions, but the conditions of thinking itself.
But can I just say why I'm particular about why I wouldn't want to be here? Because, you know, in many ways the bubble did burst, and then my Californian house has lost money, and I'm worried about California running out of water. And, you know, 5 years ago I realised I began to self-censor myself in lectures because I was worried about sort of goons in the room reporting on me and so on. So everything is kind of connected. And I do feel tremendous risk in the USA, which is where my home is now. I feel it there as well. But there is a singular reason, I think, why I wouldn't want to be in China or in some other countries. For example, you know, we're aware that Twitter is being cut, it's being pulled down, probably partly in response to self-organization in Iraq. And it's that reason why I wouldn't want to be here when people maybe stop shopping and ask other sorts of questions.
No, I mean, I think the potential for instantaneous destruction, right? You know, of various kinds. I mean, if you drive through, I mean, many of you I'm sure have seen this. I mean, the high rises in Pudong, the first ones are like 15 years old, and if you look at them, they're already crumbling, right? So I mean, which is sort of in a way symbolic of the crumbling of the instantaneous crumbling of an infrastructure that crumbles as soon as it's put up, which I think is indicative of those sort of, that relation between the surface and underneath, right? That has sort of rippled through the past 2 weeks. That is maybe more apparent in a place like this than it is you know, in California, although quickly becoming apparent in California, you know, almost on a daily basis. So maybe the lesson is Shanghai is our future in California.
Remember that last slide in Chinatown, and Jake says, forget it, Jake, it's only Chinatown. Because now,
now it is
you can't forget it. And it's not Chinatown.
It's not China.
I mean, it's everywhere.
Well, I mean, sorry, just to hop. I mean, if that is the take-home lesson, that's overwhelming and you know, problematic. But if my take-home object lesson is China, that China is everywhere, or that China is the future, that's overwhelming. But really, as well, something that
I think it's more complex than that. I think it's China at this point in time is indicative of the way things are. That certain dominant logics are playing themselves out. These things morph very quickly. I mean, with Japan, whatever, 15 or 20 years ago, and you know, those fragilities that we're marking, sort of in and of China, as being in and of the world, you know, open possibilities as well. I mean, there are opportunity costs too.
So, I mean, although Michael Keith warned us against trying to do the sort of great cities thing, I mean, what we are defaulting to there is a sort of zeitgeist model. I mean, that Shanghai is kind of the capital of the early 21st century.
But, I mean, the other way of seeing it is that there's no such thing anymore as capital. I mean, you probably could have talked about the 20th century this way. In the 19th century, maybe there was still you know, localities and so on, locations, and Paris, Berlin,
Well, maybe New York and then Los Angeles. I think. I mean, I know it's a very crude thing, but a very crude model, but it sort of works in a certain way.
No, but I mean, the new model, of course, is that you can't have a capital. Partly because of the things you were saying.
But it exemplifies a condition as well. I mean, Paris wasn't so central, let's say, to financial markets in the 19th century, but it was central to a certain way of understanding the formations of modernity, and it's
being in the world.
There's another way that you could read it. I mean, I think it came out in some of the comments. China is a very peculiar situation in the world economy because it is the production center for so much. You know, so it's a production center. No other country is a production center in the way China is. At the same time, it's part of a global financial system and it's emerging. That's where it wants to go. So in a funny way, it has a bigger internal contradiction than any other country, because it is a production, high volume, low profit, pure value production in the old model, and yet it's also the site of a certain type of global arbitrage, and it's that combination that makes it very peculiar as a diagnostic, because you're pulling across, and a lot of the things that people are talking about are from that shearing between these two models. There's no other place that has both models working quite in that way, especially with China now and the government trying very consciously to redo the production model. I mean, that's part of what's happening. So that's why it's such a weird system in its moment. So you read China almost then as a peculiar conjuncture of a rip. I mean, of a torsion. I mean, yeah, and that's the way I tend to try to read things in China, because then you can understand why the hinterland. I mean, where those things fit in, and why Shanghai. All right, why Shanghai is the node, and Hong Kong was earlier. All right, for access to the global system, and where that global system is going. And why Shanghai wants to model itself after London and New York, and why Mumbai talks about modeling itself out of Shanghai. It's a very interesting effect, and then you have to look at these places in terms of that production circulation balance, or something like that, a rift. I don't know how you want to.
So maybe not a singularity, but I don't know what we're saying, particularity, rift, plateau. But I mean, so there is a reason to be here in particular.
Well, but also the way in which all these cities are representative exactly in their unrepresentativeness. I mean, each one is like not representative, but they're representative in this. It's not uniqueness, but it's some of these sort of strange conditions that obtains. I mean, you take Shanghai, you take Beijing. I mean, they're all representative in this non-representative way. I think that's a real paradox.
Can I just add one thing about the level of subject formation? I mean, we began by, and it was in the reading from Foucault, where the neoliberal Homo economicus is the man of enterprise, right? And it may be that these different cities represent different modes of enterprise, right? Sort of in their contemporary condition, each somewhat differently, if not overlappingly, and in circulation now with each other, in increasing intensities, right? And so there's something to be thought about how subject formation both happens and circulates, and influences and impacts and so on, sort of across these regions. We should open it up to Javier.
Do you think that maybe we are here with August and China is probably the engine of the world precisely because it's the country or the economy that is taking more risks? I mean, let's say in any aspect that you want to look at it, it's going farther in terms of risk than any other country. I mean, it is risky, extremely risky to have like all these productive forces, these factories, without a proper health system and a proper law regulation. But they do it and it works. It was risky, the Olympics, in terms of branding and image, but they took the challenge. Let's say or we're talking about, it is extremely risky to put the CCTV building when nobody wants it, but they take the risk. So I'm saying that maybe they're pushing things farther than nobody else, and this is something maybe particular here. I mean, of course they can do that because of political regime, but also maybe because they are the most entrepreneurial in that sense that you are referring now.
I mean, everything that's happening that has revitalized Italy, which is kind of bizarre, in the fashion, really is coming from here. So you have tentacles that are going everywhere, and if you look at the whole port town of Naples, it's been entirely transformed. All of these palazzi are still the 17th, 16th, 18th century palazzis have become practically little warehouses where all the Chinese goods are stored. So, I mean, to me, you know, it's really like the other side of Blade Runner. You have China in town, even in Italy. So, okay, so the bubble burst everywhere. It's going to burst even in Naples. But what is striking here is that, I mean, when I was in New York in the early 80s, and it was the post-depression time of the 70s, and there were all these dilapidated empty buildings, people managed to transform. So this operation of morphing and transforming that we were talking about was possible in the urban fabric. You took the warehouses, you took the lofts, it became artist studio, you did something with whatever form of dilapidation capitalism had left. Now, when I look at these skyscrapers that were built 50 years ago, which are crumbling, and this is not Piranesi's ruins. We're talking about a different form of crumbling here. And I imagine what you would do with this. I mean, that's the part that Simon scares me in terms of saying, I don't know if I would want to be here. I mean, I don't know how in the world I would imagine to take these structures and find, maybe this will be the challenge, to find a way to take these structures and figure out how to transform them and how to make them move within the fabric of the city, rather than looking at it as like an empty
Well,
thing.
economically, I'm not immune, but I can get sort of greater or lesser distance from certain state apparatus. That's what I'm getting at. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm getting a little worried about the trend of singularization that's kind of emerging. I mean, it's useful, of course, to remind ourselves of the scale question, that indeed that, you know, that these kinds of processes are at play, not just in, you know, many other cities or many other locations, but that, yes, one can recognize a certain scalar dimension, which, you know, scared the hell out of me when I went to see Udon yesterday, last night. So that's, I think, something to keep in mind. I mean, what is the effect of scale, of course, you know, without singularizing, I mean, because that, I think, is a very modernist move. You know, it's always that sort of searching for the origin of the process, right? That will transform the entire world, what have you. I think, to my mind, there is something to be considered in the whole question of sameness, in the whole question of a plane of comparison, of constructing planes of comparison. And what scale does to that plane, how it transforms it, how that plane is not merely sectional, but, you know, indeed has depths, right? And then the other observation would also be that along this vein is that we might also want to think about the relationship between hermeticism and a kind of broadcasting, which also seems to be at play in this conversation particularly about design China branding, right? Which we see everywhere in the world. So for me, that was a puzzle with which I started looking at the CCTV building phenomenon. I mean, very neat, because CCTV is a building about broadcasting, and yet it's also a symbol of the Chinese state and of a certain control, hermeticism, and, you know, a reminder of the closing off of certain channels of communication. So I think that there's another sort of play that's at work. Again, it's not completely unique to China, but has a kind of dimensionality here that may be useful to think with, particularly as we abandon questions of, you know, as we introduce questions of arbitrage and abandon questions of nationalism. I think those two things are simultaneous.
I wanted to bring you back to the bubble, the burst of the bubble. And I'm wondering if perhaps, it's not a question about is there a bubble, but multiple bubbles, and in which locations do they burst, and does it happen simultaneously, or how do they affect one another? Just thinking about the internet bubble bursting, like in around 2000, and then we think about the economic crisis, and in both cases, it seems like the scale is actually happening on the level of visibility, that in both cases the drama that happened was actually not on this very sort of like tangible material visibility. In both cases it was something very virtual and very digital that happened. And in one case it was in this very literal sense that it was about the digital economy and that model that bursted, and then sort of that virtual economy that sort of built in part of that model but also built on speculation and risk-taking. And when I was here during sort of when that whole economic crisis sort of started, really sort of like getting larger and larger and discussed more in the media, I was here in China during that time, and a lot of people, in my research, but also in private conversations, told me, it was always like in between joking and actually being quite serious, don't go back to the United States. You have to stay here. Everything will break down over there, you're safe here, or you have the opportunities here, And I just like to think of that when you were talking about Shanghai, what is Shanghai, or, the question would also be, what is Beijing, why Shanghai? So that always that competition also between those two cities, which I find very interesting, and which you see in other sort of like national contexts as well. And so I just wanted to bring in this sort of like notion of the invisibility that Akbar was also talking about, how that also happens both in a very digital space, in a very physical and material space. And I'm thinking a lot about, we talked about sort of this, it's not just something either from the bottom up or from the top down design or resistance. There is very much sort of both happening. And you see a lot of that in between happening actually in the digital space in China, even though it's always known as like, it's about information restriction, it's about control, it's about blocking Facebook, it's about blocking other things. But then you see actually quite different experiences that don't always just focus on that, where people talk about starting bulletin boards and using their own language there. And this reminded me similar of some of the artwork we were seeing, developing their own language to talk about political issues. And it's a language that uses, for example, animal names, to reference particular political points. And, so this is neither quite from the bottom up, nor is it like from the top down. It's sort of like a very gradual pushing back. I like the word pushing back more almost than like resistance, because it's not a strong form of resistance. Because when you go to an internet cafe, people are not necessarily being like, oh, this is political action. People don't talk about it that way. But it's something in between, and it's both happening in the digital and physical and all the way across. So I just wanted to bring that in to connect the bubble and the visibility and those things.
Look, it fares better than 1989. But I mean, this is what's in my memory. We've seen green shoots before. But one thing that's, I don't know, I was going to put this on the table as well. I'm not sure that we're all, because CCTV has been a motif that we've used quite a lot, and it's a great motif, and I was wondering if we're all reading it in the same way. On the one hand, and this is what Cool Nas is doing. On the one hand, it's presenting to you like this sort of shocking image of the closed circuit of state apparatus. But of course, at the same time, he's presenting to you the shocking image of the closed circuit of state apparatus. He's made something visible. And he's made kind of a talking point, it's a conversation point. And this seems to be a certain skill. I mean, it both appalls me, and to use Akbar's word, it also fascinates me. And it will be a conversation point, I think, in precisely at a time when otherwise the apparatus seems to be invisible, and this is a point that's been raised by sort of other people I've been talking to in the seminar. The representation of the Chinese state seems to have completely disappeared from Shanghai. It seems to have completely disappeared from its museums, and I'm aware of it when I'm trying to search for stuff, and I keep getting these phony failed connection messages. And I think it's in that it's into that arena that Koolhaas suddenly introduces this sort of paranoia critical building that in many ways seems to sort of lampoon the state apparatus. But anyway, that's just another reading.
You remember Dewey called it a fascist building, right? Which is
Quite.
maybe misleading, but worth discussing in terms of what you said and also what Jen said.
Yeah, but
Is it a fascist building?
Where
What
does it originate?
Spears Stadium was in 1933 or not?
I mean, could we make that connection, for example, or not?
No, I think
I would think
it's
not.
the perverseness of the form.
That's
It's also a very efficient
perversely fascist building.
It's perversely fascist. I mean, it's depicting fascism as a perversion.
yeah, it's you know, if you
It's
remember the whole
ingenious.
perverse architecture debate, right? Which is it was precisely about that. I mean, how can a building be all things to everyone?
In the meantime, Albert Speer's son is building Germantown.
It's not now.
Yeah, Germantown is designed by Albert Speer's son, which is apparently kind of part of the brand.
Where is he building it?
In Shanghai.
Yeah. For real?
I believe so, yeah.
What?
Is that an urban legend or is that real?
No,
I believe it.
I
I
think
know.
it's really
The Olympics,
really-
the Olympics corridor, we master plan that too.
yeah.
Knowing that it is a sun, it's not exactly.
Well, that's
It may have more
perversely
cocktail
fascist.
party.
But is it really any more perverse than walking out onto Waihai Road and finding yourself in the equivalent of any mall anywhere in the world? I mean, this is what I keep kind of shifting in my mind how to think about this China that I expected to find and didn't find. And I keep flipping around with all these little kind of visits that I've been making. Starting from the Shanghai History Museum at the bottom of the Pearl Tower that ends right at World War II, so that the whole of the communist period is not part of Shanghai history. And then I began to look, okay, where is this kind of state, where is the communist China? And you bump into it every now and then. Like there's some kind of exhibition hall in the socialist style right across from the Portman Ritz-Carlton on Nanjing Road. There's the Mao's house here. And all of these things are kind of like memory spikes reaching with a prosthetic form into the past, but they're no more salient than in the present than Ai Weiwei's apparently political discourse, which I found even less political than the next guy who's, I always forget that artist's name, who talked about how the state designed him, and then he got redesigned going to America, and then redesigned again, traversing back into China. These are kind of, now I'm thinking like, okay, it's not erasure, it's not disappearance, it's much more complicated. It's here, it's not here. It's a fold. It's that subtlety. And it's where power is, it's like everything that everyone's been talking about. But you can ethnographically experience this walking around. It's just been fascinating.
But I wonder if you just couldn't extend that argument and say that the shopping mall is the state's design for a citizen. That in fact, the representation of the state is not in, this, 1940 building or that particular monument, but it is really simply on the surface of how we are encountering
That's
the
what I
city.
mean to say.
And yes, exactly. And I think that the sort of forgetting, the sort of active forgetting that is part of the apparatus of shopping, is part of the design. I mean, you don't actually have to look for it. It's actually just right here.
Conversationally, sharing back to your comment, and I completely agree with you about this state of shopping mall and the urban citizen. Shanghai, I mean, Ai Weiwei said this, that Shanghai is everything it's about China and everything that China will be or become.
but Shanghai historically has always been the least Chinese city. And so there are places we can go to see what you want to see, but we have to get out of this city. And it's not, this city has never been about that. In some ways, this city is the surface and the underneath. Because, I mean, you know, the reason for so much pairing of Shanghai and Hong Kong is because they're different, but they're also completely hooked into the world economy. One of the reasons I found what Ben had to say so interesting and persuasive is because if you sort of look at this contemporary round of capitalism as distinctively marked, like what is its particular move, right, by financialization and risk and financial instruments, that the ways those kinds of services create new exigencies and opportunities in diverse places. I mean, where Shanghai comes colliding into these, right, is when you know, you just, I mean, I am fully persuaded by the theme of this seminar, because China is designing everything in a certain way, right? All sorts of things are getting made and remade at once in a more kind of radical, extensive way than ever before anywhere. I'm rather persuaded by that. And so, but you know, no country ever industrialized in an era of being so hooked into the world economy. And that, the multitudes of intersections at stake in that are extraordinary to try to contemplate. I think we can. And I would just want to caution against, sometimes I feel like I'm hearing this sort of mystification of what is China right now. And this is the one time I'll use it. Westerners have done that for centuries.
I want to go back to what Maria said. It's interesting, I was thinking through that for a while, about this idea of the neoliberal home economicus being a man of enterprise, and we went to talk about how maybe because China is taking risks. And so I started thinking, China is what or who? So what subject is taking a risk here? And I thought what the state is doing is not so much taking risks. I know what you mean, but it's effectively pushing on the risks to various groups. For instance, when you say there is no health care, or one could add to that no workplace safety, the risk is being borne by the worker on behalf of this, right? So, or if you can think of, the Olympics, the branding, the kind of national risk exercise, there could be major demonstrations, things to go out of hand. The risk is being borne by those dissidents who get, potential dissidents either, who get put to jail, or the people who have to bear the humiliation of something like a facade put in front of their businesses and homes. So, I mean, it's a kind of risk management that it does, which affects various groups differently. And from this, I was sort of thinking about and maybe Albert, you can talk to this, speak to this. The word fascination for me has a sense of, I'm going there because I'm thinking of the kind of affect that we have when we come here. Has a sense of spontaneity. I'm not sure that what I'm feeling here has much to do with spontaneity. So in a sense, I'm wondering if it's fascination I'm feeling, or whether I'm just reliving certain kinds of modernist enchantments that have been handed down to me. I mean, Paris, New York, all this came out in London. So it's just, it feels like I am excited because this is what I'm expected to expect in a way.
Well, can I just have one point on this? You are expected to expect. There's a somewhat debatable, though persuasive argument constituted within a book called Capitalism. The Capitalism of Chinese Characters. Huang Yashan's book. Other people must have read it.
Capitalism of Chinese Characters.
Yeah, and a couple of those chapters, right, basically make the argument that Shanghai has been paid for by everywhere else. That is that in the fiscal restructuring that took place in 1994 and after, which the state rearranged the fiscal system to get more money out of everywhere, that in reassigning money, right, it's taxation, that more money has been given to Shanghai, to build Pudong. It's a state project to make Shanghai look like this. at many other provinces and cities' expense. And he makes the argument at the expense of the rural sector.
I was going to say that we do that we do that in New Orleans. You know, we flood certain sections of New Orleans in order to preserve.
Sorry, I wasn't there last night.
To preserve, you know, event culture.
Also, to quickly go back to this, the business of Foucault. Maybe we should have
The business of the car.
It's a business. One thing I found kind of useful to read, not something that we haven't read, but maybe, I don't know, maybe you could still put it up on our website, is the 4-5 page, very short Deleuze essay, Postscripts on the Societies of Control. But there's only one translation that's good, and the other ones are horrid. It's the one in the book Negotiations. That's a collection of his short essays on interviews, where he argues that what we have now seen is this shift from disciplinary societies to societies of control. And at various points throughout these 2 weeks, I kept thinking of that, and we kept giving examples of that in many ways. Constantly, that kept coming up.
I mean, that might be one way of starting a discussion of fascination, because fascination at one level is a form of self-control, right? I mean, it's like it's your affect that is being controlled, so it's a form of mystification. But so I think that's certainly one angle. But another angle would be this contrast that goes back as far as Kierkegaard, where he draws a distinction between the interesting and the fascinating. Right? The interesting is something that draws you for a reason. When you're interested in it for some reason. So, and it has to do also with things like certain notion of spontaneity might enter into it. Right? I'm interested. This is right. So I want to do this. I mean, that's one level. Fascination. If you link it up to fascination as a possible mode of critique, right, rather than as a form of mystification, you'll say that fascination is a kind of relationship to what you don't know. Right? What you don't know, it's something that's completely different from the interesting. Because the interesting is something that you know why it's interesting. Right? Fascination is something that draws you without your knowing why. Right? So it's neither knowledge nor ignorance, it's a relationship to what you don't know. Right? It's a certain relationship, it's like you have to jump some kind of gap. And you want to talk about risk here, that's why the Kierkegaard context, right? I mean, there is a certain risk here. In the sense that unlike a kind of proper how should we say, theoretical or investigative method, you're never sure of the outcome. I mean, it could be a complete waste of time. Right? I mean, the objects that fascinate you could turn out to be nothing. Right? That's why someone like Benjamin starts out by saying, we are always dealing with objects riddled with error. I mean, you can't tell from the beginning, right, whether something is right or wrong. Right? You're always dealing with these mixed objects. And that for me is also one way we could relate to design and the design process. That to a certain extent you can say, it begins in this idea of fascination. Right? Not just fascination as mystification, which of course, fascination as mystification is already, in relationship to a type of control which would be soft control, right? The control of affectivity, which of course is it's a kind of.
Yeah, I know that I keep going back to the drives, but it actually has everything to do with fascination, in the sense that if you were to, for example, read Shaw in his essay, The Call of the Sirens, or A Song of the Sirens. There's a very important paragraph on fascination.
Yeah, exactly.
And it is, in other words, the fascination is with one's own destruction.
Yeah.
And that's where the death drive, I think. I mean, I know that I've been trying to posit the time of the drives endlessly, in addition to historical time or bracketed time, but I think this is where it's appropriate in relation to fascination.
I mean, it's like the way he analyzes, I think maybe in the same essay, Moby Dick, right? The white whale, which are these objects that
And it's different from enchantment. I mean, I think that's the part that's, and it also, therefore, to me, has less to do with the idea of also the sublime or the spectacle or this moment of totality. With fascination is a different. To me, also, I mean, this is probably my take on it. The idea of the error also means to err, which it also means to wander or wander off. So fascination is a journey. It's a process. It's something that's less about the moment of enchantment, the spectacle, the sublime. It's more connected to the possibility of that. And it's not desire. But it's closer to that than it is to the fulfillment of the pleasure.
of course it changes. Because like you might say erring and so on. In the 19th century, the mode would be the flaneur.
Yeah.
Right? Today we let our fingers do the walking, right?
Yeah.
Because of iPhones and so on and so on. So, right?
But it includes that kind of, yeah.
Bring it to an end. Okay. I think the end would be the beginning, right? Because, I mean, I really feel this, that we've started something here, and that's maybe really the main thing we could say. I think it's a certain set of initiatives which I think can be developed in many different ways, and I think some of us fully intend to do this. So, you know, I'm glad that in this wrap-up session we don't really have a complete wrap-up, because it's like, really there are lots of lines. I call them lines of flight, if you like. But, I mean, there are lots of lines which are being opened, and maybe we should sort of look at it in that light. So, thank you, everybody.